So since today's guest has operations in Hong Kong and Singapore, both of which speak Chinese, I thought it would be most appropriate to give a slight mistranslation or a blooper from Hong Kong. And this appeared in English in a dentist's office in Hong Kong. And it said very simply, teeth extracted by the latest Methodists. So with that, today's guest is Adrian Kingswell. Adrian is the founder and CEO of two businesses, Mezzo Labs, an analytics consultancy, and Uplifter, a SaaS platform, both based in London. He is the first to admit that his global expansion was driven more by his heart than his head, a passion for meeting interesting people in faraway countries that started as when he was a backpacking student and has continued through his 30-year business life. In 2017, he opened Mezzo Labs Hong Kong, and then 2 years later, Mezzo Labs Singapore. His clients are not only based in those cities, but also in neighboring Malaysia and Indonesia. So welcome, Adrian. Delighted that you're with us today.
Delighted to be here, Philip. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So let's start by giving everyone a bit more elaboration about your background. You were backpacking. Was it around the world, or was it primarily in Southeast Asia when you got the bug for international business?
This is back in a long time ago in my student days. After I graduated, I decided before I settled down and got a proper job that I would see something of the world and set off with a backpack to America, traveled through the States, flew out to Japan, where I stayed for a year, had a fantastic time in Japan, actually met the woman who was going to be my wife many years later, and traveled through China, flew down through Hong Kong to Indonesia, went up through Malaysia, and then I got sick. I managed to catch hepatitis. And even though my ambition was to continue backpacking through the rest of the world and eventually end up back in England, unfortunately I had to fly back home early. And I've never completed the journey. So I vow that one day I'm going to go back to where I left off, which was actually, it was Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And so I'll fly back to Kuala Lumpur and finish the rest of the journey with a backpack. And say that I finally did it sort of 50 years after I started.
That's wonderful. It's just superb. And how did you come up with the name Mezzo, which, by the way, for Americans is spelled, well, in British English, it's M-E-Z-Z-O, and in American English, it's M-E-Z-Z-O.
That's right. Well, it's a strange one. You know, when you try and you think you've got a great name for a company and you think, right, this is it, we're going to do it. And then you Google it and you suddenly realize that someone else has beaten you to it, or it's easily confused with something else. Or you run it by your friends and they say, oh, that sounds like something completely different, something totally embarrassing. So I spent a long time trying to think of a name for my company and practically gave up. And I was thumbing through a dictionary, just trying to find different words. And I knew that I was going to be in the business of something to do with marketing. So I was looking for something that sounded good next to the word marketing. And I was looking at musical terms. And I saw this word mezzo appear in front of other words like mezzo soprano, mezzo forte, mezzo piano. And I thought, well, that sounds good. If I put that in front of marketing, it's mezzo marketing. That has a nice ring to it. Okay, let's see if someone's registered this name before. No one's registered it before. So I could get Mezzo Marketing Limited. Fantastic. The domain name, can I get a URL? mezzomarketing.co.uk. Yes, I could. Fantastic. Okay, even better. Let's do it. So I launched the company, won my first contract, handed my business card to an Italian guy in Barclays, my first client. He takes one look at my card and says, ah, you have an Italian name. I'm like, really? He said, yes, mezzo. In Italian, it means half. So mezzo marketing, it means you do half marketing. Why don't you do whole marketing? That's what we want. Like, oh, crumbs. Got it wrong. I hadn't bothered to look up what the true meaning of mezzo was. So I thought a little bit about it and realized that the word half in marketing was, it came up in a phrase, I think coined by John Wanamaker, or one of the early industrialists of America, who said that half my marketing works. I just wish I knew which half. And so I said, in mezzo marketing, we'll tell you which half works. and which doesn't. Fortunately, managed to dig myself out of a hole. Anyway, after a while, the name Mezzo kind of stuck. We changed it from Mezzo Marketing to Mezzo Labs as we moved into analytics, and we decided we needed something a bit more scientific. Anyway, nowadays people just refer to us as Mezzo, so it really doesn't matter.
That's wonderful. My company, as you may know, provides language translations into 120 languages, and one of the services we offer is we call it name evaluation or name screening, exactly for that purpose, to know, whether the name has any negative meaning or pejorative meaning, perhaps in other languages, and then, obviously letting the client decide whether to use it, whether to move forward.
Yes.
So that's another classic one. That's really superb. So tell me a bit about Mezzo Labs and what you do, and for what reasons you've based in Singapore and Hong Kong, and where your clients are in Indonesia and Malaysia, and you're in London.
So when I started my business, and it was just me to start with, I was just a consultant. I was working in the digital teams of banks in the UK. And in those days, we were just counting the number of visitors that came through a website using a term called hits, which is basically the number of times a web page is served. And that was the only metric that we had to work out whether people were actually getting to the right place on the website, is whether each page had enough hits. And then one day somebody came in and said that we want to install something called Web Trends on our website. Web Trends was an early competitor to Google Analytics. And it was able to show you things like what paths people were taking through the website, or how long people were spending on a page, where they might be dropping out of a process. And it was really a tremendously powerful tool that gave us insight into the experience of users through our sites. And I thought, there's something in this. And almost by a process of elimination, as I focused the business on where the real value of our work was, more and more it was on the analytics side of things. So after a number of years, we realized that we were in the game of just providing analytics to our clients, putting in place the right technology, and then collecting the data and analyzing it, and turning the analysis into insights or actionable insights that our clients could use to improve the performance of their sales and marketing. So basically, we collect numbers about what's happening, and we tell people where they can sell more stuff to different kinds of people. Got very lucky with that, in as much as the market kind of opened up before us. So we were very much riding a wave of interest in analytics. And also lucky being based in London, England, where it's a pretty mature digital market. I mean, the penetration of e-commerce into our market is right up there on a per capita basis. Is probably equivalent to America in terms of the amount of spend per person. So there's plenty of business here serving companies that want to sell more online. And as a result of that, my business did pretty well out of as a consultancy. We won HSBC as a client. HSBC invited me to go to Hong Kong with them. And this is probably about 7 years ago. And it happened to be around the end of January, beginning of February, which you might know is Chinese New Year. So imagine me getting out of the train from the airport in sort of downtown Hong Kong, and stepped out at the street level, and all the buildings are lit up like, I'm just going to say like Christmas. No, it's beyond Christmas. I mean, it is just an amazing sight to see Hong Kong, or probably any Chinese city that's got its New Year lights on, Year of the Rooster, I think it was. And I looked up, and it was like a scene from Blade Runner. If you know the opening scene of Blade Runner, where there's the sort of the flying taxi is sort of coming into land, and it says Los Angeles 2019 underneath. Right. It felt like that. It felt like I'd gone to the city of the future. Without a backpack this time, just to sort of travel on a suitcase, I was walking through the streets of Hong Kong thinking it would be so cool to open an office here. And then a few days later, HSBC said to me, you know, if you opened an office in Hong Kong, then you could be serving us in Hong Kong and not just in London. So it would make sense if you did that. So like you said in my introduction, more from my heart than my head, I wanted to open an office there. And then it was a question of figuring out whether it was really cost justifiable, whether there was going to be enough business from HSBC and other businesses, other customers that I could win out there, whether I could make a go of it. Took about a year to make that decision and to find the right person to head up the Hong Kong business. And I found the guy, and he was a British expat. He'd been living out there for 3 years already. He understood our market, so he was the ideal choice. So we started the business in Hong Kong, and then almost immediately we were winning clients in Hong Kong and also in Singapore. Oh. So it was probably a 50-50 mix in terms of the clients that we're winning between Hong Kong and Singapore. Ironically, not one of them was HSBC. And to this day, HSBC is still not decided to go ahead with us. That might change, but it's a big organization and they don't take decisions very quickly out there. However, it has been a really interesting, challenging, but interesting journey out there but particularly in Hong Kong through the COVID years. That has been a big challenge. And just before the COVID years, we had the civil disobediences or civil unrest in Hong Kong as well. If you remember the guys in the streets with the umbrellas, which has made the Hong Kong itself quite unpredictable as a market, and also its relationship with mainland China has made business in Hong Kong a pretty challenging thing. But what typically happens in Asia Pacific, as you probably know, is when Hong Kong suffers, then Singapore gains. So it seems that a lot of businesses switched from Hong Kong to Singapore. And because we have offices in both territories, where one goes down, the other one goes up. So overall, it's been good.
Has the Communist Party infiltrated, that's the proper word, I suppose, has the Communist Party infiltrated your operations in Hong Kong and been telling you what to do and how to do it?
Not directly. Not directly. I mean, ultimately, it's just business is the same wherever you are in the world. You know, you look for an opportunity, you look for clients who have a problem that you can solve, and if you can do it cost effectively, then you have a business. So it's not, any market has its challenges, and I think Hong Kong is no different in that. So the Chinese government haven't actually specifically said, you can't do this, you can't do that, or you have to do it this way. That hasn't happened. We're just aware of the fact that the environment is challenging. A lot of larger companies that are our clients have decided to leave. And that's really why we're needing to reduce our operation in Hong Kong. It's just that a good 50% of our customers have moved somewhere else. And most of them actually have moved down to Singapore. So we're not losing them. We just have to shift our focus. But it's an ever-present feeling that the market is not going to be what it was a few years ago. It's, you know, Hong Kong as a business location has changed. It will no doubt become something different, you know, going forward. Whether that's good for us, Mezzo Labs, or not remains to be seen. But I don't think it's reinvented itself yet. It's in the process of doing that. Clearly, it's going to become more of another Chinese city rather than that sort of safe harbor in the center of the Orient.
So in terms of business practices, I understand, of course, you're losing. Your clients are moving. You're not losing them, but your clients are moving to Singapore. But in terms of Hong Kong itself, have the business practices changed? Have you had to adjust anything because of communist rule?
No, it's a good question. I think we're aware that things might change. I think where things have changed is from a legal point of view. The Hong Kong was a very attractive place to start a business because the system, particularly the legal system, was essentially colonially British. Right. It was the legal system looked practically identical to the British legal system. So it was very easy for us to look at something and see whether we'd be whether we'd have protection or not. And I'm thinking particularly around, say, IP protection, intellectual property protection. Mainland China, whole different story. So we felt a sense of protection when we located our business in Hong Kong. And what appears to have changed over the last few years is the fact that if you could still go through the Hong Kong legal system, but there's a right of appeal that could go up into mainland China. So, and that's where, at that point, obviously, you know, we couldn't afford to take things much further. We have not had, like most businesses, any reason to take anything legal. We haven't had any legal problems in Hong Kong. So we've not actually come into contact with how that system works. So, you know, I'm probably not the best person to comment on really whether the entire system has changed to the detriment of local businesses, because I've not needed to use the Hong Kong legal system. Anything else that's changed? I mean, I think we're aware that if we were to employ people that Beijing didn't like, then we might get a tap on the shoulder.
Yes,
you know, that I think we're quite aware of. Or if any one of our staff decided to become a little bit militant, we might get a tap on the shoulder. So, you know, we're conscious of that. It hasn't happened. You hear stories. You don't know whether, you know, how much truth is in there, but you know, certainly you're aware of the fact that you have to be careful about who you employ, what they're saying, and you have, you know, you're held in some respects responsible for what your employees might believe in or what they might be saying.
So do you vet new employees by looking perhaps at their Facebook pages or their social media? And the other question, so the communists have not tried to steal your IP, I presume?
No. To be honest, I don't think they're interested in it. What we do, and there's a reason we haven't gone into mainland China, and it's not really to do with the politics. It's the fact that the digital infrastructure in mainland China is very different from what it is in the rest of the world. People don't tend to have websites as you or I would know them. They set up in you know, in Alibaba, in WeChat. They set up their storefront within those closed wall environments. So if I go in there and say, hey, we can track users through your website and we can put Google Analytics in there and find out what's going on, people will say, well, that's just not the way it works here. So Mezzo Labs doesn't actually have much of a proposition for a mainland Chinese company. And that's probably the main reason that we don't operate in that, you know, that side of the Great Firewall of China. And it's less to do with you know, the
IP
sort of,
itself.
the IP, exactly.
Right.
So there's really very little risk of a mainland Chinese company stealing our IP, because it wouldn't be of any great gain to them in China. To the rest of the world, it might be, but I think that there are other companies that would be higher up the list of that sort of thing.
And then vetting new employees, do you check their social media pages? And what if you do find one who has got the skills, the technical skills that you're looking for, but perhaps has protested against the Chinese rule?
It's a very difficult situation for us as a UK employer to get right, because of course we can't discriminate against somebody because of what they believe in,
right,
or because of a previous political history or something like that. So we'd be breaking the law of our own country if we were to say, I'm sorry, you can't have the job because you believe in something that the Chinese government doesn't like. Fortunately, the number of staff that we employ in Hong Kong is relatively small, and we're moving out of the territory anyway, so it will become less of an issue. But you know, I do know of companies who've been told not to employ so and so, and even companies in London that have been told not to employ somebody because of their and clearly you'd be breaking the law if you were to fire somebody because of what they believed in. But it's a difficult thing to reconcile.
Wow. Yeah. The Chinese say, of course, that they don't impose their will onto other countries, which of course is a huge lie, but it's a good example of how it is a lie. In Singapore then, Singapore more or less also has a British system and a Western system.
Yes.
Do you find that doing business in Singapore differs in some way from doing business in the UK or in other countries?
Singapore, I'd say, is probably one of the easiest places in the world to open up a foreign company, and for several reasons. And one of them is because it's so kind of global as a city. It doesn't really exist if it doesn't think globally. It's just by its nature. Originally it was a port. It's not, as a country, it's a very new country. And it's survived, it's thrived because of that flow through of international trade. So it has a very, it's a highly regulated market, and it has certain constraints about it. But in terms of attitude to doing business, it's very recognizable, particularly for a Western company like my own. You go out there and you don't really notice any cultural barriers. You don't notice any different ways of doing business that you wouldn't see in your own country. In fact, there are almost bigger differences between my clients in the UK from different industries, the difference between, say, a major retailer and a major bank, than there are between a bank in London and a bank in Singapore. They're practically, in terms of culture, business culture, they're practically identical. English is the first language of the country. So even though they have different ethnicities within Singapore, the lingua franca is English, and very, very good level of English. It's all taught in schools. Written and spoken English is absolutely superb. So there's very little barrier to doing business. Once you've got yourself set up, you've got to, you need to tick a few boxes in order to create a limited company, as you would anywhere else. But once you get going, you find that actually it's a pretty straightforward market to operate in. I'm not going to say it's easy. Nothing's easy, but there's a lot harder places to set up a business. Yeah.
And then also you do business in Malaysia and Indonesia, I presume, from Singapore, or do you?
From Singapore, yeah. We haven't set up a limited company in those countries at the moment because, I mean, we're only a stone's throw away from those geographies, from having been located in Singapore, and they're quite used to dealing with Singapore companies. So there's not really an issue there. And there are obviously differences in their markets as well. Things do start to become more regionalized once you step into Malaysia and Indonesia. To the extent where it often helps to have a local partner to bridge the gap. But that's not difficult to do in our sector. We're a consultancy, we're an expert in doing stuff with the technology, and there are technology companies that we partner with. We use their tool set, and they have relationships and they can open doors for us where it might take us longer to get into those companies in Indonesia or Malaysia. But really, that's how we've been introduced into those markets. It's through our partners.
And what was the partner's name that you mentioned?
Oh, there's several partners that we have out there. They're different. They would provide technologies that we would use to help us do analytics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you find that the marketing methods or the pricing methods are different in Indonesia and Malaysia?
It depends on how you do the pricing. If you, because we're an agency or a consultancy, one of the standard questions is, we'd like to see your rate card. And then, of course, when you show them the rate card that's meant for Singapore or Hong Kong to somebody in Malaysia or Indonesia, they think that you've got the international exchange rate wrong. But unfortunately, our staff are located, they're expensive people and sitting in expensive countries. So that is the rate card. So what we end up having to do is come up with a fixed price and then figure out how we're going to deliver the work for a fixed price. So it's almost irrelevant what our rate card is. You're really selling to the value of your solution, to what difference it makes to that business, rather than the cost of the labor to do the work.
Yes, that makes sense. In terms of advertising, first of all, Indonesia and Malaysia are both Muslim majority countries, and their languages are very similar. So when you do business there, do you find that there are differences in the business practices, or are they similar as the countries are?
Every market, even within, I mean, you could say, you could look at the United States of America and say, what's the similarity between East Coast, West Coast, the South and the North? You know, so there are massive differences in every market. And I think, you know, culturally, there are differences between Indonesia and Malaysia. And what's more important to us actually isn't the cultural differences so much as their maturity with digital, with e-commerce. And I would say overall that Indonesia, even though it's a very big market, is digitally less mature than Malaysia, which is less mature than Singapore. But they're all on a curve, and we kind of, because the UK is and America is much further ahead, we can almost point to them where the future lies, what they're going to be doing in a few years' time. And what we generally find is that we don't sell to the mass market in these geographies. We're selling to the pioneers, the leaders, the ones who are sort of blazing a trail. And so, for example, our Indonesian client is one of these cryptocurrency platforms. So this is not what you'd expect to be popping out of Indonesia, but you know that they've got a proposition for trading Bitcoin and things like that. And of course, they are far more digitally advanced than your regular Indonesian company, and that's why we have them as a customer. But that's essentially what we're looking for in those markets, is not the mass market, but the early adopters, because we've got something interesting to offer them.
What kind of industries do you penetrate or do you target? Banks, retailers, you said cryptocurrency, manufacturing? What are the kinds of...
Philip, anyone that's got money.
That's not all. That's the criteria.
And honestly, that's probably why we focus on banks. I think, as John Dillinger once said when he was asked by the judge, why do you rob banks? He says, because, Your Honor, that's where the money's at. And we, based in London, you know, we're right on the doorstep of the City of London, you know, one of the largest sort of financial centers in the world, and we'd be crazy not to knock on a few doors around there. And my business is very network driven. So once we win Barclays as a customer, the chances are we will win the other high street banks at a certain point, because people move around and they'll take us with them. So there's a lot of growth by osmosis. You know, the banking sector has been very good to us through the peaks and troughs of the economy. But there are other sectors, and effectively anyone that has a website and spends a decent amount of money driving traffic to that website, so they care about whether that traffic is converting into customers or not, then they're going to be looking at the numbers and trying to figure out you know, which half of their marketing is working and which half is not.
I guess I've got two separate questions. I guess back to Indonesia, Malaysia. So you focus primarily on early adopters, high-tech companies, and so forth. Are there any, when you do proposals, when you do presentations, are there differences of how you would do it in Indonesia, Malaysia versus how you might do it in the UK or in Europe?
It's a good question, but no. We tend to believe that at the proposition level, that where our value sits with our clients, it doesn't really matter culturally, geographically, where they are. What's more important is whether we can derive some value out of our work that will help them improve their commercial performance. So what we do struggle with, actually, in a lot of the Asian companies, is that there will be a team of people that we immediately get some sort of resonance with. The analytics team, the digital team, will completely get what we're trying to tell them. If we got you better quality data and we managed to turn that data into really useful, actionable insight, that you should be able to sell more stuff to people. The moment they take that outside of the room and try and get some budget for it and try and get senior figures in their organizations to buy into the concept, there's a lot of kind of nodding of heads and chin stroking, but ultimately they're not really digital natives. They're not really bought into it, and they're much more used to more traditional ways of, or more predictable ways of doing commerce. So they're more risk averse. There's less likelihood that one person, one maverick in an organization will say, damn it, we're going to do this because it makes sense and I trust these guys and we're going to push this through. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, well, we'll move on and do something else. I tend to find that in Asia, that's not the way that things get done. So we don't need to change our pitch to them, but we are trying to identify somebody or a group of people who collectively will agree that this is a good idea and it'll drive forward. I think as a result of that, most of our customers out in Asia Pacific tend to be global. They tend to be global multinationals. We haven't really managed to penetrate the local markets particularly successfully. And I don't think that's because we're outsiders. I think it's more to do with the fact that it's just identifying people with the mindset that would say, yes, this is worth doing. It's a bit, very often what we hear is, so who else around here have you done this for already that's not a global multinational? Well, we're still trying to find people that, or they'll find reasons why, okay, they're outliers. They're a crypto platform in Indonesia. That doesn't really count. So I'm looking for someone that runs a department store here in Jakarta. Can you show me 3 other department stores that are doing this stuff? And you go, well, no, we can't. And that's the problem, is the risk aversion is just different. And the willingness of individuals to step up and say, look, I'm just going to champion this and drive it through, which we find more of in the UK and a lot more of in the United States. So that sort of an individual will drive this forward and champion it. We struggle to find similar types in the Asian market.
Yeah, I think that's a difference that other guests also have highlighted. I'm sorry, there's a siren outside. I'm not sure if
it's not for you.
No, it's not for me. They're not coming for me yet, but perhaps this afternoon, we'll see. One of the issues we found in Asia that other guests have highlighted it in general, certainly in Japan and Korea and in China, well, it's different in China, but that it's very much a collective decision making. And the people to whom you're presenting may be the junior managers, and the silent person in the room is probably the CEO, the managing director, the president, who may have the final decision, but ultimately it's a collective decision. Whereas in the Western world, it tends to be either top down or, as you say, they're champions who can push it through and get a senior person to buy in and then approve the budget. So I presume what you're facing is this collective decision making, or the reticence, as you say, because people don't necessarily like to be different, don't like to be mavericks, don't like to be, don't like to be different, I guess is the best way.
Yes, that's right. And so we have to deal with it, and we have to find ways of working. It's not as if Western companies don't do business in these countries.
Right.
They just have to find a way of getting a sort of very conformist culture to agree collectively and to move forward. Or just accept that not every company is going to want to buy your product or service. Maybe 9 out of 10 don't, but 1 out of 10 does, and that's fine. That's probably more than enough for us. So just spend more time with the ones who are going to drive it forward. And then what we do is we try and make as much noise about the successes in the market as we possibly can. Enter awards and do joint marketing, so you get some publicity out of it. And so the more that you do this, then the more likely that the next tier down, the sort of early adopters, just below the pioneers, then that they will get on board. And so that's kind of what we want, is just more stories of success, so that people feel that it's the right thing to do, the right thing to step into.
It's interesting that you use the word conformist. Confucian cultures, Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, Singapore to some extent, and Vietnam to some extent, are Confucian cultures, and they are very conformist, socially, economically, politically, and so forth, and certainly culturally. But Malaysia and Indonesia are more Muslim cultures, and I don't think of them personally as conformist, except in the idea that one submits to authority. And in Islam, Islam means submission to God, but it also has a connotation, although Muslims may not agree, but that there's the spillover of submission to authority, to a higher authority, such as the managing director, such as the CEO, whomever, or to the boss, even if it's a junior person submitting to the boss. So when you say conformist, do you feel it's conformist in the Confucian sense, if you're familiar with that model, or is it a different kind of conformity?
Well, certainly in the Confucian sense, I think, that the companies that might be based in Japan, where it is very, very conformist, and to some extent in the other countries as well, in Singapore and Hong Kong. In those other markets, I think there is a sort of a deference to authority, that, and getting access to the more senior people, the more decision-making characters. It's not impossible, but you've got to play a longer game. And it's true in the Chinese and Japanese markets as well. I mean, in China, they talk about getting guangxi with senior people, getting that sort of, getting on with them as people outside of the office, going out to restaurants and showing your generosity to them. In Japan, it's extremely important as well that you go out and get drunk with your future customer, and you don't talk about business, because they want to see what you're like as a person and whether you're trustworthy and the kind of person that they can depend on. And so getting access to the senior decision makers does take longer, but once you're in there, of course, that presents a barrier to entry to all of your competitors. So once you're in there for a long time.
Yes.
And they will be less price sensitive, and they will take you to places that you could only have dreamt of. So it really, I think for us, we have to look at the market over a longer period of time and just weather some of these short-term storms and get through to the people who really matter on our client side. And then, and then it will be good. It's a market that it promises short-term returns, but in reality, all markets really only work if you hang in there for a long period of time and work out the right way to do your business in that market.
Yes, it's very true. You use the word guangxi, which is Chinese, and it basically means influence, connections, people who can help grease the wheels. Is that the best way to describe it?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I don't know whether I pronounced it correctly, probably murdered the language there, but yes, I mean, essentially it's a kind of sense of, it's like the unspoken side of doing business. It's that kind of, you've done all the right things around the outside, and therefore they feel nice and comfortable in the center. Whereas I think a lot of Western business is like, it goes back to a contract and a statement of work or a service level agreement. And it's like, did you do this on time, on budget, zero defects, like fine. But the actual more social side, which actually I think we're quite good at in our company, we do want to make sure we look after people and we socialize quite well with our clients. But that's almost like the icing on the cake. Whereas I think it's almost like in Asia, it's the other way around, that you've got to get that around the outside right, first of all. And then, of course, if you get that right, then the actual delivery of your product or service is going to be good as well. Yes,
and traditionally, especially American companies, they're very anal about conforming to the contract. And if you miss a deadline or something, they can threaten to sue you or something.
Yes.
Pretty horrible. But in these kinds of Asian cultures, what counts more is the trust, the relationship, the connections, the credibility that you've built up over time. And the contract is less important. The contract states more the intention, the goal, the intention of what you're trying to achieve, rather than the specific the specific terms. The terms are important, of course, but if you miss something, they'll understand that what counts is the trust, the relationship, the ongoing confidence in the relationship that you built up with everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's the tough thing is that you've still got to run a profitable business in those markets.
Yes.
So you've got to be careful of cost. And, you know, the laws of economics at some point kick in, and you realize that there's a lot of money being spent on Guangxi here. When are we actually going to do some business? So,
right.
You know, it is a balancing act. And it is tricky because although you spend a lot of time getting the spirit of things right, getting things flowing in the right direction, you can come unstuck. Like we've done a lot of free work for clients, which in the West we would have charged for. And in the East, we've basically just said, look, it's all good. Let's just keep this thing going. And then you look at the profitability at the end of the year and you think like, wow, that was not as profitable as we thought it was. Because we've had to do a lot of free stuff.
Yeah, wine and dine and cultivate.
Well, more than that, actual parts of because a lot of our projects, you know, they in the fog of war, you can't predict exactly how much time it's going to take, how much effort it's going to take to deliver something, but you figure that as long as you're pointing in the right direction, you'll make it work. And then there's a few more requirements are lobbed in, a few timescales are changed, and you go, okay, whatever, we'll deal with it. And then when you do the numbers at the end of the day and you look at that project and you realize that you've burned way more hours than you actually had budget for, then it doesn't happen a lot, but when it does happen, it's a sting in the tail. And actually our projects in London are much more likely to land, you know, on time, on budget. Whereas out in Asia, the chance of it, of scope creep, of extra stuff being done that you can't bill for is much, much higher.
Yes, that would make a lot of sense. One final question before we close. Do you find, let me change that. In the Western world, advertising can be very creative. Puns on words, or the Apple slogan, think different, for example. Do you find that advertising in Asia differs in that way, or does it have its own unique method to it?
I'll be honest, Philip, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question because there are people that are far more attuned to the advertising markets than I am. But it is apparent when you deal with the marketing in the Asian markets, you look at some of their creative and you think, I don't know why you can call this creative. I can't see the creativity in here. You know, I could have done a similar job in PowerPoint and put that on a poster, which has been really disrespectful, I guess. But they know what works in their market. It wouldn't work in our markets. You know, the sort of the style of advertising where they just try and cram as much noise into the space as possible wouldn't work in the UK because we're expecting a more sort of creative, polished product, a concept of feeling, a simplicity to the message as well. I think we take for granted how refined our creative industry is. You go to Asia and the local audiences want to see a very strong reason for buying the product. So usually it's price, an offer, something that will make them feel good very quickly. So it's a much more of it's more aggressive advertising, and it works. It clearly works. Otherwise they wouldn't do it. So it would be easy for me to look at it and say, well, gosh, that's years behind what we're doing. But it's just a different market.
Yes, different appeals, different benefits and appeals
differently. And if it wasn't working, then they wouldn't do it. So at the end of the day, yeah, you have to do what works for your market.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say before we conclude?
I think looking back on my time, and it will go on for many years, hopefully, but my time in global expansion, what are the learnings? And sometimes while I could be criticized for not doing more research and not actually thinking it through a lot harder and just jumping into a market with both feet, honestly, I could never have planned for the way that things have turned out. Some of the challenges that we've had, everyone's faced. I mean, you know, pandemic. I mean, it's just like nobody saw that one coming. No one saw the political situation in Hong Kong changing quite as rapidly as it did, and in the direction that it did. So I don't think all the research in the world wouldn't have flagged that as a risk, as a potential risk. There would have been other risks flagged, possibly to the extent where I wouldn't have done it at all, and I'd be a sadder person as a result of that, because it brought me joy to actually stand there and say, wow, look at me, I've done this. You know, this tiny company from London, and I've managed to open an office in Hong Kong and another one in Singapore, and against all the odds, I seem to be doing all right. And it's just doing it for the joy and the thrill of it is something. It has to add up at the end of the day, it has to make a profit, has to do that. And if it wasn't, then we need to pull out. So far, we've managed to keep our head above water, and we are wiser, if not richer, at the end of the day. And I think that justifies it, to be honest. Mind you, we're not owned by a PLC on my own. You know, I own the shares in the company, so I can make these sorts of decisions. We don't have to return dividends to shareholders. But unless you jump into the deep end, you won't know whether you can swim or not. And sometimes it's better to just get on and do it than to spend forever deliberating it. So my lesson is keep your overheads as low as you can, and be very mindful of what the divorce cost is of pulling out. Make sure that it's not any more money than you can afford to burn. But you will learn things super quickly, and that process of surviving and winning in a foreign market, I think is just a wonderful experience. And you know, and if I had the chance to do all over again, absolutely, I'd do it again.
That's marvelous. Well, thank you so much. That was extremely insightful and extremely helpful, and wonderful lessons for everyone.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.